Today is May 4th, 2026, and something happened this week that fundamentally changes the calculation for everyone watching this conflict, and almost nobody covering it has explained the full picture of why it matters as much as it does. Iran submitted a peace proposal through Pakistani mediators. 3 phases, specific language, specific timelines, and buried inside that proposal is a detail that tells you everything about how desperate the regime's internal situation has actually become. Not the demand for war reparations, not the demand for American forces to withdraw from Iran's periphery, not even the demand for strait control. The detail that matters most is the one Iran is trying to hide in plain sight. They want the blockade lifted in 30 days? Read that carefully. The regime that spent 47 years turning patience into a military strategy, the regime that outlasted Saddam Hussein across 8 years of brutal industrial warfare, the regime that ran circles around every Western negotiator across every nuclear deal ever attempted by simply weighting the other side into exhaustion, that regime just submitted a proposal with a 30-day deadline for its own relief. That is not a negotiating position. That is a distress signal dressed in diplomatic language. And understanding why that 30-day number is in that proposal is understanding everything about where this conflict is actually heading right now. But let's back all the way up. Because to understand what Iran's 30-day demand actually means, you need to understand what's been building inside Iran's oil infrastructure over the past several weeks, and why the clock that Tehran is working against right now is not the one its officials are talking about in public. Here is where we stand as of today, May 4th, 2026. The U.S. naval blockade of Iranian ports, which went into force on April 13th after the Islamabad talks between J.D. Vance and Iranian negotiators collapsed, is still fully active. CENTCOM has confirmed that since April 13th alone, American naval forces have intercepted 45 ships and forced them to turn back. 45 ships in 20 days, that is not a ceasefire enforcement mechanism. That is an economic strangulation operation running at full operational tempo, while the diplomatic track publicly pretends a ceasefire exists. Iran, for its part, is still blocking the Strait of Hormuz and still demanding over $1 million per vessel in transit tolls on shipping it chooses to allow through. You have a dual blockade. The United States blockading Iranian ports from the outside, Iran choking the strait from the inside. And sitting between those two forces is approximately 20% of the world's entire seaborne oil supply and a comparable proportion of global liquefied natural gas. Every day this continues, the pressure compounds. But here's the critical detail that separates this week from every previous week of this conflict. The pressure is no longer just external. It is now showing up inside Iran's own oil production infrastructure, and that changes the entire strategic geometry of everything that follows. Iran's Ministry of Industry, Mine and Trade issued a public warning this week about car prices, telling consumers to be careful about buying vehicles and attributing recent price increases to artificial market manipulation. That statement sounds like routine consumer protection communication. It is not. It is the regime's early warning system for economic stress, signaling to its own population that the purchasing power destruction already underway in the automotive market is not the government's fault. The same ministry simultaneously confirmed plans to import used cars, which is the institutional equivalent of a government admitting it cannot maintain the domestic manufacturing ecosystem that new car availability requires. These are not independent data points. They are symptoms of the same underlying condition. The blockade is starting to affect mainland Iran's real economy in ways that the regime's communication apparatus cannot fully manage. But that is the secondary story. The primary story is what is happening to the oil infrastructure itself. Tehran has started cutting crude output early to avoid hitting storage limits. Read that sentence again, slowly. The Islamic Republic of Iran, the country whose entire governmental financial architecture is built on petroleum revenue, has begun voluntarily reducing its own oil production. Not because demand has fallen, not because wells are failing, but because the tanks that hold the oil it is pumping out of the ground are filling up faster than the blockade is allowing that oil to leave the country. A senior official described the move as precautionary. He said engineers can now idle wells without long-term damage and restart them quickly. He said the industry has enough experience and is not concerned. That is exactly what an official of a regime under maximum economic pressure is required to say publicly. Now watch what the regime is actually doing, because that is the only data that matters. And what it is doing is reducing production before it has to, which means it already knows that if it does not reduce production voluntarily, it will be forced to reduce it catastrophically when the storage tanks hit their physical ceiling. The precautionary shutdown is the regime choosing a controlled descent over an uncontrolled crash. And that choice, made in this specific window with the blockade at 45 ships turned away and the economic fury operation running simultaneously, is the operational confession that the 30-day deadline in the peace proposal is not a diplomatic construct. It is a geological and infrastructural deadline dressed in political language. Now let me explain exactly why the storage crisis is more dangerous than any military confrontation this regime has survived, because this is the part that most coverage is treating as background economic context when it is actually the central story. Iran's oil wells are not light switches. They are pressure systems built into geological formations that behave according to physics, not diplomatic calendars. When a well is shut in, reservoir pressure drops. Water begins to seep into oil-bearing rock formations. Pore structures that held hydrocarbons in productive configuration begin to collapse under their own weight. Some wells, once shut in under these conditions, permanently lose a portion of their productive capacity. Not temporarily, permanently. The reactivation cost for a shut-in well is billions of dollars in investment. Requires engineering expertise that Iran's sanctions-degraded oil sector has been losing access to for years, and even under optimal conditions, produces less output than the well was generating before shutdown. This is why Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has been publicly tracking Karg Island's storage capacity. This is why the 30-day demand in the Iranian proposal is the most revealing number in the entire document. The regime's own engineers have told its own leadership how long the current production levels can continue before the tanks overflow and the forced shutdown begins. And that number, whatever it actually is close enough to 30 days that 30 days ended up in the peace proposal. The clock Iran is operating against is not the diplomatic clock. It is the physics clock. And physics does not negotiate. Now, let's talk about Operation Economic Fury, because this is the second track running simultaneously with the naval blockade, and it is producing consequences that Secretary Bessent described this week in language that should be quoted in full. He said the United States began with maximum pressure last March, and 3 weeks ago the president ordered Treasury to begin economic fury. He said, and these are his exact words, "We are suffocating the regime, and they are not able to pay their soldiers." He described it as a real economic blockade in all parts of government with all hands on deck. He confirmed that the Treasury has tracked IRGC money held offshore, money accumulated across 47 years of what he characterized as stealing from the Iranian people, and that the United States is freezing those assets and will preserve them for the Iranian people on the other side of this conflict. Read that last phrase carefully. On the other side of this conflict. That is not the language of an administration planning to negotiate the IRGC back to financial viability. That is the language of an administration that has already decided the IRGC's financial empire ends when this conflict ends, and is preserving the assets for whoever governs Iran after the organization that has been running it loses that authority. But the detail inside Bessent's interview that carries the most strategic weight is not the broad description of economic suffocation. It is the specific role that the UAE played in accelerating the financial strangulation, and why Iran's decision to fire 2,000 missiles and drones at the UAE during the conflict was one of the most consequential and catastrophic own goals in the Islamic Republic's history. The UAE, for years, had been what Bessent diplomatically described as somewhat permissive in allowing Iranian and IRGC money into its banking systems. Translation. The UAE financial system was one of the primary mechanisms through which IRGC-connected entities ran shell companies, conducted sanctions evasion, and laundered petrodollars into usable financial assets in a jurisdiction connected to global banking infrastructure. That arrangement existed because the UAE's commercial interests in maintaining financial flows through Dubai's banking system outweighed the diplomatic costs of the permissiveness. Iran's missile and drone strikes on the UAE during the war ended that calculation in a single decision. Countries that have just absorbed 2,000 inbound weapon systems from a neighboring state do not continue looking the other way at that state's financial operations in their banking sector. The UAE did something more than stop looking the other way. According to Bessent, UAE officials proactively came forward, provided the details of Iranian accounts in their system, and allowed the United States to freeze those assets. The regime that spent 47 years building financial infrastructure in the UAE financial system to survive American sanctions destroyed that infrastructure in the same operation it used to demonstrate military capability. That is the most expensive own goal in the history of IRGC financial strategy. And the assets that are now frozen, accumulated across decades of what Bessent called stealing from the Iranian people, are gone from the regime's accessible balance sheet in a way that no diplomatic agreement short of full American capitulation can restore. Now let's talk about the leakage, because no pressure system is perfectly sealed, and the Iranian-Pakistani border represents the one gap in the economic blockade architecture that is currently operational at meaningful scale. The footage is visible. Trucks and motorbikes crossing the border carrying oil and other goods in volumes that are real, but that need to be placed in honest proportion to what they replace. This is not a coincidence. Pakistan benefits commercially from this arrangement. The Pakistani military, which functionally controls the economy in ways the civilian government cannot override, profits from the smuggling corridor. When President Trump was asked directly about this, his answer was notably soft for a president who has described Iran as having not paid a sufficient price yet. He expressed great respect for Pakistan and for Field Marshal Munir. That is not the language of an administration preparing to shut the leakage down aggressively in the near term. It is the language of an administration managing a triangular relationship in which Pakistan is simultaneously the primary diplomatic intermediary for the ceasefire and the primary beneficiary of the economic leakage that is keeping the regime alive at a subsistence level. But here is the honest proportionality assessment that the coverage of this leakage is consistently missing. A single oil tanker carries approximately 2 million barrels of crude. The motorbike and truck corridor across the Pakistani border, operating at maximum realistic capacity, moves a fraction of that volume in the same time period. You would need approximately 17,000 motorbikes carrying 5-gallon containers, running continuously to replace the cargo of a single tanker. Iran cannot replace its tanker export capacity through a land border crossing. The leakage is real. The leakage is not strategically decisive. It is extending the timeline slightly. It is not changing the direction of travel, and the direction of travel is toward the storage ceiling that forced the precautionary production cuts that produced the 30-day demand in the peace proposal. Now let's get into what Iran actually sent through Pakistani mediators, because this is where the regime's internal desperation becomes most visible in the gap between what officials are saying publicly and what the document they submitted actually reveals. The proposal has 3 phases, and understanding each phase requires understanding that what Iranian media is reporting about the proposal is specifically curated to show what makes the regime look strong, which means the concessions Iran is actually offering are absent from every public account. The details available, sourced from Iranian media, tell us what the regime wants to receive. The silence around what Iran is offering to give tells us something equally important about how the IRGC-controlled negotiating posture is constraining the civilian diplomatic faction that actually wrote the document. Phase 1 envisions a gradual opening of the Strait of Hormuz and a lifting of the U.S. naval blockade on Iranian ports, with Iran taking charge of dealing with sea mines. That last clause is the most operationally revealing thing in the entire first phase. Iran wants to be given authority over the mine clearance operation in the waterway it mined. Think about what that means. The IRGC, which has been laying fresh mines in the strait during the ceasefire period, confirmed by Axios, citing a U.S. official, now wants to be the entity responsible for clearing those mines as a condition of the blockade being lifted. That is not a confidence-building measure. That is a request for operational control of the strait's navigational safety, dressed in the language of cooperative demining. The United States ordering its naval mine countermeasure vessels, including the USS Chief and the USS Pioneer, to triple their clearing operations is the direct answer to that request. America is clearing the mines. America is not handing the clearance operation to the organization that laid them. Phase 2 is where the nuclear dimension appears, in a form that tells you exactly how much the IRGC is willing to concede and why the American position finds that insufficient. The proposal stipulates Iran's return to enrichment after a time limit at 67%, which is the JCPOA level under a zero storage principle. It rejects dismantling nuclear infrastructure or destroying Iran's facilities. Let me be precise about what that proposal actually means in strategic terms, because the framing of it as a significant concession requires examination. Iran is offering to temporarily stop enriching above JCPOA levels and to not store the enriched uranium it does produce. It is explicitly refusing to dismantle any of the nuclear infrastructure that survived the opening strikes of Operation Epic Fury. It is not offering to destroy the production capability. It is offering to pause the production output for an unspecified period. That is not denuclearization. That is a temporary pause with a built-in restart mechanism that preserves the infrastructure required for the long game the IRGC has been running on nuclear capability for 30 years. Trump said publicly that 85% of Iran's missile-making capability has been eliminated, and that he would like to eliminate the rest. The gap between what the IRGC is willing to offer on the nuclear file and what the American administration has stated it wants is not a negotiating gap. It is a structural incompatibility driven by the same institutional logic that has produced every previous failed agreement on this question. Phase 3 is the most revealing in terms of what it tells you about the IRGC's understanding of regional reality. Iran is proposing to enter strategic dialogue with Arab neighbors and build a security system that includes the entire Middle East. The Arab neighbors Iran is proposing to dialogue with are the same countries whose populations were sheltering from Iranian missiles 30 days ago. The same UAE that just proactively gave the United States the account details of every IRGC-connected entity in its banking system. The same Saudi Arabia that has been watching the Houthi proxy it helped fund for a decade collapse as Tehran's financial flows to Yemen dried up. The proposal for a regional security dialogue from Tehran is arriving in Riyadh and Abu Dhabi as the countries whose infrastructure was targeted by Iranian weapons. The IRGC's read of regional political reality is apparently that firing 2,000 missiles and drones at your neighbors and then proposing a security partnership represents a coherent diplomatic sequencing. That read explains more about the current state of decision-making inside Tehran than any intelligence assessment could. Trump's public response to the proposal was delivered in two forms. First, to reporters, where he said he was reviewing the plan but could not imagine it would be acceptable. Then on Truth Social, in language that deserves the attention it has not fully received. He wrote that he would soon be reviewing the plan but could not imagine it would be acceptable, and that Iran had not paid a big enough price for what it had done to humanity and the world over the last 47 years. Read that last phrase, 47 years, not the current conflict, not the nuclear program specifically, 47 years. That is a statement of cumulative historical accounting that frames this negotiation not as a crisis resolution exercise, but as a settling of a ledger that predates any specific grievance. A president who frames the question as 47 years of unpaid cost does not reach a deal by lifting a blockade in 30 days in exchange for a temporary enrichment pause that preserves the nuclear infrastructure. That gap between Iran's proposal and Trump's framing of the question is not a gap that Pakistani mediators can bridge with creative language. It is a gap between two fundamentally incompatible assessments of what this confrontation is settling. Now let's talk about what is actually happening on the military track, because the economic and diplomatic tracks are running alongside a weapons positioning operation that has not received the proportional analysis it warrants. CENTCOM has briefed Trump on what is being described as a short and powerful wave of strikes. Bloomberg reported that CENTCOM requested deployment of the Army's Dark Eagle hypersonic missile system to the theater. The Dark Eagle travels at speeds that compress Iran's response time to essentially zero. There is no intercept at the speeds the system operates. There is no warning sequence that gives a target location operator time to respond. The weapon arrives before the awareness that it has been launched. That is a categorically different capability than anything in the current theater toolkit. Deploying it is not a threat. Requesting its deployment is a signal that the next escalation phase, if it comes, has been engineered to deny Iran the response window that previous strike packages allowed. The Dark Eagle request, combined with the 810 imagery, combined with Bassant's public statement that the regime cannot pay its soldiers, combined with Trump's 47 years framing, is a convergence of three separate pressure tracks arriving at the same moment, financial, military, and psychological, all three pointing in the same direction at the same time. Here is the structural risk that almost no analysis of this situation is properly accounting for, and it is the risk that keeps serious analysts awake in ways that no other dimension of this conflict produces. The IRGC Navy has been operating without a confirmed commander since March 30th, 2026, when IRGC Navy Commander Alireza Tangsiri was killed. That is over a month of command vacancy in the force responsible for the Strait of Hormuz, the fast attack boats, the mine-laying vessels, and the drone swarms. In 2008, the IRGC implemented a decentralization reform that distributed operational autonomy across 31 semi-autonomous regional corps, specifically designed to maintain capability even after leadership losses. That design feature, built to make the IRGC resilient against decapitation strikes, also means that small unit commanders in the Strait can act without central authorization. The same architecture that makes the organization hard to destroy makes it impossible to reliably control. You cannot negotiate a ceasefire with an organization whose regional commanders have structural autonomy and no confirmed chain of command above the unit level. You cannot deliver on commitments made at the diplomatic level if the unit commanders who control the actual military hardware do not receive, or do not choose to follow, instructions from above. One IRGC fast boat commander makes a decision. One drone swarm gets launched without central approval. One American minesweeper takes a hit. And the ceasefire that has been technically holding since April 8th collapses in a sequence that nobody at the top of the Iranian system actually authorized. That is not a prediction. That is a structural risk assessment based on documented command vacancy, documented decentralization, and documented precedent of IRGC units acting in direct contradiction to what Iranian diplomatic officials were publicly stating at the same moment. Now here is the most important thing about Iran's 47-year time strategy and why the blockade has broken it in a way that no previous American pressure campaign ever managed to. The reason Iran was able to use time as its primary weapon across every previous crisis was that the economic damage from American pressure, while real and significant, was never fast enough and never irreversible enough to force the regime's hand before domestic and international political pressure on the American side could be organized to relieve it. Sanctions hurt, but they allowed workarounds. Ghost fleets, Chinese buyers, Turkish intermediaries, Pakistani border corridors, cryptocurrency networks, All of these represented enough leakage that the Iranian economy, while stressed, never hit a physical wall that operated on a days, not years timeline. The oil storage crisis is that wall. It does not operate on a political timeline. It does not respond to diplomatic communication. It does not pause because a ceasefire was announced. The tanks fill at the rate the blockade prevents exports. When they hit capacity, wells must be shut regardless of what is happening in Islamabad or Oman or Moscow. And wells shut down, even the precautionary managed version that Iranian officials are currently describing as routine, permanently degrades the asset that generates future revenue. The physics clock does not negotiate. And the physics clock is the reason the 30-day demand is in the proposal. The regime knows what 30 days means for its oil infrastructure. And that knowledge, translated into a diplomatic deadline, is the clearest available indicator of how close to the physical wall the blockade has pushed the system that funds every other component of the IRGC's power architecture. Let's bring this together into a complete picture, because what you are watching unfold right now is the convergence of three separate processes arriving at the same moment in the same system simultaneously. Process 1 is the oil infrastructure collapse running on the physics clock. Precautionary production cuts already implemented, storage tanks filling toward capacity. The 30-day deadline in the proposal marking the outer boundary of what the regime's own engineers told its leadership it has before forced shutdown begins. Process 2 is the financial strangulation running through the economic fury operation. IRGC assets frozen in UAE banking system. Offshore accounts tracked and frozen. The treasury of the organization that has governed Iran for 47 years being systematically dismantled and preserved for the Iranian people who come after it. Process 3 is the internal political collapse running through the fracture between civilian authority and IRGC military control. A president who cannot control his foreign minister. A foreign minister executing IRGC orders. A parliament speaker cornered between military factions and hardline legislative blocs. A supreme leader communicating through intermediaries from an undisclosed location. And a decentralized naval command with no confirmed chain of command above the unit level operating in the world's most important energy waterway. These three processes are not running in parallel towards separate outcomes. They are converging toward the same point. The moment when the physics clock, the financial strangulation, and the internal political collapse all arrive at the same threshold simultaneously is the moment that determines whether this conflict ends in a deal or in something that nobody in any of the rooms where these decisions are being made currently prefers. The honest assessment of Iran's three-phase proposal is that it is not a serious opening position in the sense of representing a framework that both sides can negotiate from toward an agreement. It is a document designed for two audiences simultaneously, and those two audiences require contradictory things from it. The domestic IRGC audience needs to see that Vahidi did not blink, did not concede the nuclear infrastructure, did not surrender the strait, and did not legitimize American military pressure by appearing to respond to it. The diplomatic audience in Islamabad and Washington needs to see enough movement toward American positions to justify keeping the ceasefire technically alive while the physics clock runs and the economic pressure compounds. The proposal is engineered to satisfy both audiences partially and neither audience fully. That engineering is the signature of a negotiating team that understands what an agreement needs to look like, but does not have the institutional authority within its own system to produce one. Aragchi can move toward the American position in the room. Vahidi's network will cut across the communication chain before the movement becomes a commitment. That pattern has now repeated enough times that the Trump administration's response to the latest proposal, they haven't paid a big enough price yet, is not diplomatic frustration. It is a strategic assessment that the current Iranian leadership structure cannot deliver a binding agreement regardless of what language appears in a 14-point document submitted through Pakistani intermediaries. So here's the question that sits underneath all of this. The question that Pakistan's mediators and Oman's back-channel operators and every Western government watching this from a careful diplomatic distance is asking without publicly answering. Can the physics clock produce the one outcome that neither side's stated position currently accommodates? Can the oil storage crisis, arriving at the 30-day outer boundary that the regime's own engineers specified, force a decision from the IRGC faction, controlling Iranian policy, that the economic strangulation and the military posture alone could not force? Because if the answer to that question is yes, then the most consequential event of the next 30 days in this conflict is not a strike package or a diplomatic breakthrough. It is a storage tank on Karg Island reaching its physical capacity, and the conversation that happens inside Tehran in the hours immediately after that happens. If the answer is no, if the IRGC's institutional survival calculus continues to override the economic reality the way it has overridden every previous pressure point, then what happens after the 30-day window the regime itself specified is the question that the A-10s on the ramp and the Dark Eagle deployment request and Besant's statement that they cannot pay their soldiers are all positioned to answer. The regime spent 47 years making time its weapon. Every crisis, every negotiation, every American administration that came to the table expecting urgency and found patience. The hostage crisis lasted 444 days because the regime understood that 444 days was within the American political system's tolerance. The Iran-Iraq War lasted 8 years because the regime understood that outlasting Saddam was achievable if it was willing to absorb the cost of 8 years. Every nuclear negotiation stretched for years because the regime understood that Western negotiating fatigue was a reliable resource that replenished with each election cycle and each change in administration. That strategy required one thing to work. It required time to be on Iran's side. The physics clock has removed that requirement from the equation. The tanks are filling, the wells are being cut preemptively. The 30-day demand is in the proposal, and the administration sitting across the table from that proposal has described 47 years of unpaid cost as the context within which it is evaluating the proposal's acceptability. The weapon that kept the Islamic Republic alive across 4 decades of American pressure has been neutralized. Not by military force, not by sanctions alone, by oil tanks on an island in the Persian Gulf filling toward a ceiling that the regime's own engineers set as the outer boundary of the system's survivability. The time weapon is gone. And what the regime does in the 30 days it has left before the physics clock produces the answer that 47 years of patience was designed to prevent is the only story that matters in this conflict right now. Drop your prediction in the comments. Does the regime find a way to bridge the gap between what Vahidi will allow and what the physics clock is demanding before the 30 days expire? Or does the storage crisis force a decision that 47 years of strategic patience could not? Subscribe and turn on notifications. This situation moves faster than any daily news cycle can track. And the next major development is not weeks away. It is already being measured in days.